Years passed, and Apex Innovations became a shining example of what a modern workplace could look like. The company wasn't just thriving financially, it was thriving culturally. Employees spoke proudly about their jobs, not because of the perks or the paycheck, but because they felt valued. They weren't just cogs in a machine. They were part of something bigger than themselves. And at the heart of it all was Maya, whose leadership had transformed the organization from the inside out. Maya's impact extended far beyond the walls of Apex Innovations. Her story spread throughout the industry, inspiring other companies to rethink their own practices. She was invited to speak at conferences, write articles, and even mentor aspiring leaders who looked up to her as a role model. Yet despite the growing recognition, she remained grounded. Fame wasn't what drove her. It was the belief that everyone deserved a fair shot at success. One day, while preparing for an upcoming keynote speech, Maya found herself reflecting on how far she'd come. She thought back to that chaotic morning when she'd been mistaken for someone unimportant, blocked from entering her own meeting. It still made her chuckle sometimes, the absurdity of it, but it also reminded her of why her work mattered. Every time someone underestimated her, every time assumptions clouded judgment, it reinforced the need for change. What struck her most, though, was how much growth she'd witnessed, not just in others, but within herself. Leading Apex Innovations hadn't been easy. There were days when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, when setbacks tested her resolve. But through it all, she'd learned to lean on her team, to trust in their collective strength. She realized that true leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about creating space for others to step up and shine. Greg's transformation was one of the clearest examples of this philosophy in action. Over the years, he had gone from being the face of bias to becoming a champion of inclusion. He continued to lead workshops, mentor underrepresented employees, and advocate for equitable policies. His journey wasn't without challenges. He still stumbled occasionally, saying or doing things that required reflection, but he never stopped trying. In fact, his willingness to embrace vulnerability inspired others to do the same. One particularly memorable moment came during a company-wide town hall meeting. Greg stood up and shared a deeply personal story about his upbringing. He talked about growing up in a small town where diversity was practically non-existent, how he'd carried those narrow perspectives into adulthood without realizing it. "I used to think I was open-minded," he admitted, "but the truth is, I was blind to my own biases. It took someone like Maya walking into my life and calling me out for me to see clearly." The room fell silent as Greg spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. When he finished, there was a beat of quiet before applause erupted. People approached him afterward, thanking him for his honesty. Some even opened up about their own struggles, sharing stories they'd never told anyone before. That day marked a turning point not just for Greg, but for the entire company. Conversations around inclusion became less guarded, more authentic. Trust deepened, connections strengthened, and the sense of belonging grew stronger. As Apex Innovations celebrated its 5th anniversary under Maya's leadership, the company hosted a grand event to honor milestones and achievements. Employees gathered in the newly renovated atrium, decorated with vibrant banners and photos showcasing memories from over the years. Speeches were given, awards handed out, and laughter echoed off the walls. But the highlight of the evening came when Maya took the stage. She began by acknowledging the progress they'd made together. "When I first walked into this building, I didn't know what to expect," she said, her tone warm and reflective. "But what I found was a group of people ready to dream bigger, work harder, and build something extraordinary. Together, we've proven that success isn't just measured by numbers, it's measured by the lives we touch along the way." Her words resonated deeply with everyone in the room. For many, Apex Innovations wasn't just a job anymore, it was home. A place where they could bring their whole selves, where their voices mattered, and where their contributions made a difference. Maya paused, letting the gravity of her message sink in, then added, "None of this would have been possible without each and every one of you. So tonight, let's celebrate not just what we've achieved, but who we've become." The crowd erupted into cheers, standing ovations, and whistles. As Maya stepped off the stage, she was greeted by hugs, handshakes, and heartfelt thanks. Among them was Greg, who pulled her aside for a private moment. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for giving me a second chance, but for showing me what real leadership looks like." Maya smiled softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've earned everything you've accomplished," she replied. "Don't forget that." As the night wore on, Maya found herself standing near the edge of the atrium, watching as employees danced, laughed, and connected. She felt a profound sense of fulfillment, not because of the accolades or the success, but because of the ripple effect she'd helped create. Change wasn't linear, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was possible. One person could spark a movement, and one movement could transform countless lives. In the years that followed, Maya's legacy continued to grow. Apex Innovations expanded globally, opening offices in cities around the world. Each location embraced the same values of inclusivity and innovation, proving that culture could scale alongside ambition. Former employees who left to start their own ventures often credited Maya's influence, carrying her lessons with them wherever they went. Stories circulated about interns she'd mentored rising to leadership roles, projects she'd greenlit revolutionizing industries, and communities she'd uplifted through corporate social responsibility initiatives. Even after retiring from her position as CEO, Maya stayed active in shaping the future. She founded a nonprofit focused on providing opportunities for underrepresented groups in tech, ensuring that the next generation wouldn't face the same barriers she had. Her mantra became a rallying cry for aspiring leaders everywhere. Progress isn't about perfection, it's about persistence. Looking back on her journey, Maya often thought about that fateful morning when everything changed. It was a reminder that moments of adversity can be catalysts for growth, that mistakes can lead to meaningful change, and that leadership is as much about listening as it is about leading. She didn't set out to make history, she simply set out to do what was right. And in doing so, she left a mark that would endure long after she was gone. Apex Innovations thrived not because of one person, but because of the collective effort of everyone involved. Maya's vision became their reality, a testament to the power of unity, resilience, and humanity. And though the road ahead would always present new challenges, one thing was certain: the foundation they built together was strong enough to weather any storm. At a busy international airport, an elderly woman sat comfortably in her seat, waiting for the plane to take off. She was dressed neatly, her suitcase packed with care, ready for her long journey ahead. This wasn't just any seat, it was a premium spot in the VIP section of the flight, reserved only for first-class passengers. The ticket had been a gift from her son, who always made sure she traveled in comfort and style. Her son wasn't just anyone. He was a successful CEO of a tech company that had recently become one of the biggest names in the industry. For him, buying this ticket was his way of showing love and gratitude to the woman who had raised him with so much care. The terminal buzzed with activity as people hurried to their gates. Family said goodbye, business travelers typed away on their laptops, and kids tugged at their parents' sleeves, eager to board the plane. Amid all the chaos, the elderly woman felt calm. She adjusted her scarf, glanced at the boarding pass in her hand, and smiled softly. Everything seemed normal until it wasn't. As the last few passengers boarded, A flight attendant approached her with what looked like hesitation written all over their face. The attendant forced a polite smile, but avoided making direct eye contact. "Excuse me, ma'am," they began, their voice wavering slightly. "We've got another passenger who needs this seat. Would you mind moving to economy?" The woman blinked, caught off guard by the request. She'd paid for this seat, just like everyone else in the first-class cabin. It wasn't something that could simply be taken away from her. Politely, she asked why someone else needed her seat. The flight attendant fumbled for words, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, they admitted the truth. There was a high-profile corporate client seated nearby, a white businessman traveling on behalf of a major partner of the airline, and apparently, his presence warranted rearranging the seating plan. The elderly woman felt a mix of emotion, surprise, confusion, and even a touch of anger. But she didn't raise her voice or make a scene. Instead, she calmly refused to give up her seat. After all, she had every right to stay where she was. Little did she or anyone else know that this small act of defiance would soon spiral into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. When the plane finally landed hours later, the elderly woman picked up her phone and dialed her son's number. As soon as he heard her voice, he could tell something was different. There was a tone in her voice that told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary conversation. She explained what had happened during the flight, the awkward exchange with the flight attendant, the thinly veiled suggestion that her seat belonged to someone more important, and how she'd stood her ground despite feeling disrespected. Her son listened quietly, letting her finish before speaking. Growing up, he'd faced plenty of situations where he'd been treated unfairly because of the color of his skin. He'd worked hard to build a life where such things wouldn't define him anymore. But hearing about this incident involving his own mother stirred something deep inside him. It wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who might face similar treatment without having the means or platform to speak out. Determined to do something about it, he sprang into action. First, he called his legal team to draft a formal complaint to the airline's executive board. Then, knowing how powerful social media could be, he logged onto his Twitter account and typed out a short but pointed message, even in 2023. My mom is being asked to give up her seat because someone else is more important. Let's see how far we've really come. Within minutes, the tweet exploded. People from all corners of the globe chimed in, sharing their outrage and support. Some recounted their own experiences of discrimination while traveling, while others praised the elderly woman for standing her ground. Hashtags like #RespectForElderly and #Equality in Travel started trending, turning the story into a global conversation. What began as a quiet moment between a mother and her son was now a full-blown movement, shining a spotlight on issues many thought were relics of the past. Back at the airline's headquarters, executives scrambled to respond. They knew were in trouble not just because of the viral backlash, but because the man behind the tweet wasn't just any customer. He was a CEO with influence, resources, and connections that reached far beyond the aviation industry. And if they didn't handle this situation carefully, they risked losing not just public trust, but also valuable partnerships that kept their business afloat. For the elderly woman, none of this was expected when she woke up that morning. All she wanted was a safe and comfortable flight to her destination. But sometimes, life has a way of turning ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. This was one of those times. The call between the elderly woman and her son ended with a heavy silence. She could hear the frustration in his voice, even though he tried to stay calm for her sake. For him, this wasn't just about one incident, it was about years of experiences that had shaped who he was today. Growing up, he'd faced countless moments where he felt like he didn't belong, like he wasn't good enough simply because of the color of his skin. Those memories still lingered, buried deep but never fully forgotten. Now, hearing about what happened to his mother reignited those feelings. It wasn't fair. No matter how far he'd come building a successful company, earning respect in an industry dominated by people who didn't look like him, it seemed some things hadn't changed at all. His mother, who had always been his rock, deserved better than this. And so did everyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation. Determined to make a difference, he started making calls. First, he reached out to his legal team. These weren't just any lawyers. They were sharp, experienced professionals who knew how to navigate corporate politics and hold big companies accountable. He gave them clear instructions. Draft a formal complaint to the airline's executive board and demand answers within 24 hours. This wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. Next, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Knowing the power of social media, he logged onto his Twitter account, a platform where he had hundreds of thousands of followers, and typed out a short but impactful message. Even in 2023, he wrote, "My mom is being asked to give up her seat because someone else is more important. Let's see how far we've really come." He hesitated for a moment before hitting send. Once it was out there, there would be no turning back. But he also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. With a deep breath, he pressed the button. Within seconds, notifications began pouring in. Likes, retweets, comments all flooding his timeline. People from around the world chimed in, sharing their outrage and support. Some recounted their own stories of discrimination while traveling, while others praised the elderly woman for standing her ground. Hashtags like #respect4elderly and #equality in travel quickly gained traction, turning the story into a global conversation. As the tweet went viral, the pressure on the airline mounted. Journalists picked up the story, news outlets ran headlines, and talk shows invited experts to discuss systemic racism in the travel industry. What started as a private phone call between a mother and her son had now become a public reckoning. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the CEO sprang into action. He contacted the airline's top executives directly, demanding an explanation. His tone was firm but professional. "This isn't just about my mom," he told them. "It's about your company's values. If you can't treat people fairly, then maybe you shouldn't be in business." The executives stammered through their responses, clearly caught off guard by the sudden spotlight, but the CEO didn't stop there. Using his connections, he arranged meetings with key stakeholders including advertisers and corporate partners, tied to the airline to discuss the implications of continuing business, relationships with a brand that failed to uphold basic human decency. By the end of the day, several major sponsors publicly announced they were reconsidering their contracts. The financial hit alone would be devastating if the airline didn't act fast. Back at home, the elderly woman watched the unfolding drama with a mix of emotions. On one hand, she was proud of her son for standing up for what was right. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the attention. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the thought of strangers dissecting her life made her uneasy. Still, she understood why this mattered, not just for her family, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible or undervalued. As the hours ticked by, the airline scrambled to respond. Their first attempt was a generic apology posted on their official website. "We regret any inconvenience caused," the statement read, without addressing the specifics of the situation or acknowledging the racial undertones of the incident. Predictably, the response fell flat. Critics pointed out that the language was vague and lacked accountability. Social media users tore into the airline, accusing them of trying to sweep the issue under the rug. Things got worse when internal emails leaked online. In these messages, senior management discussed strategies to mitigate backlash rather than take meaningful action against those involved. The leaks painted a picture of a company more concerned with protecting its image than fixing the problem. Public trust plummeted further, and the hashtag boycott airline name began trending alongside the others. Feeling the heat, the airline's leadership team held an emergency meeting. Tensions ran high as executives argued over the best course of action. Some advocated for transparency and accountability, urging the company to admit its mistakes and make amends. Others clung to outdated notions of damage control, insisting that firing a few employees would placate the public and restore order. The debate grew heated, with voices rising and tempers flaring. Through it all, the CEO remained focused. He knew this wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about exposing a system that allowed such incidents to happen in the first place. He wanted real change, not performative gestures. So, he continued pushing forward, leveraging his influence to keep the pressure on. Every interview he gave, every statement he released, reinforced the same message. Justice needed to be served, and the airline had to do better. By the time night fell, the situation had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. The elderly woman sat quietly in her living room, watching the news coverage unfold. Despite the chaos, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this moment would spark a larger conversation about fairness and equality. Maybe her small act of defiance would inspire others to stand up for themselves too. And as for her son, he knew this was only the beginning. Holding one company accountable was a step in the right direction, but the fight against prejudice was far from over. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had struck a blow against injustice, and the world was watching. The airline's initial response to the growing storm was a textbook example of how not to handle a crisis. Their first attempt at damage control came in the form of a generic apology posted on their website and social media channels. "We regret any inconvenience caused," it read, with no mention of what exactly had happened or why it mattered. The statement avoided addressing the racial undertones of the incident altogether, leaving many people furious. It felt hollow, like they were trying to check a box rather than take responsibility. For the CEO, this half-hearted apology wasn't just disappointing, it was infuriating. He knew that when you hurt someone, especially in such a public and personal way, a vague "sorry" wasn't enough. People wanted accountability, transparency, and real change. But instead of owning up to their mistakes, the airline seemed more focused on protecting its brand image. To make matters worse, internal emails leaked online within hours of the apology being released. These emails revealed that senior management had been scrambling behind the scenes, discussing ways to mitigate backlash rather than address the root cause of the issue. The leaked emails painted a damning picture. One executive suggested offering the elderly woman a free upgrade on her next flight as a way to smooth things over. Another proposed blaming the flight attendant involved, calling them a rogue employee who acted outside company policy. Reading these messages, the CEO felt a surge of anger. This wasn't about one bad apple. It was about a system that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked. He couldn't let them get away with deflecting blame onto low-level staff while ignoring the bigger problem. Public reaction to the leaks was swift and brutal. Social media erupted with outrage, and journalists pounced on the story, dissecting every word of the leaked emails. Critics pointed out that the airline's leadership wasn't just failing to take responsibility, they were actively trying to shift the narrative to protect themselves. Hashtags like #corporate cover-up and #justice not apologies trended alongside the others, further amplifying the backlash. Customers began canceling flights, and major sponsors started pulling their partnerships, citing concerns about the airline's values. The CEO knew he had to keep the pressure on. Using his influence, he reached out to key stakeholders, advertisers, corporate partners, and even government regulators to discuss the implications of continuing business, relationships with a company that clearly didn't prioritize fairness and equality. He made it clear that this wasn't just about his mother. It was about setting a precedent. If airlines could treat passengers this way without facing consequences, what message did that send to the rest of the world? By the end of the day, several major sponsors publicly announced they were reconsidering their contracts with the airline. One prominent credit card company issued a statement saying they were deeply troubled by the incident and would be reviewing their partnership. A global hotel chain followed suit, emphasizing their commitment to diversity and inclusion. Each announcement sent shockwaves through the airline's leadership team, forcing them to confront the reality that their actions or lack thereof were costing them dearly. Behind closed doors, tensions within the airline's executive board reached a boiling point. Some members argued for transparency and accountability, urging the company to admit its mistakes and implement meaningful reforms. Others clung to outdated strategies, insisting that firing a few employees would be enough to placate the public and restore order. The debate grew heated, with voices rising and tempers flaring. One executive slammed their fist on the table, shouting, "If we don't fix this now, we're done." Another countered, "You think firing people solves anything? This is about systemic issues." As the arguments raged on, it became clear that drastic measures would be necessary if the airline hoped to salvage its reputation. Finally, after hours of back and forth, they agreed on a plan. Less than 48 hours after the story broke, the airline issued a second statement, this time taking full responsibility for the incident. They confirmed that not only had the flight attendant been terminated, but the entire ground staff responsible for handling customer complaints related to the flight were fired as well. Additionally, the airline pledged $1 million toward diversity and inclusion initiatives, promising sweeping reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. While some praised the firings as evidence of accountability, others criticized the move as performative punishment. Labor unions representing airline employees condemned the mass terminations, arguing that systemic issues couldn't be resolved by scapegoating individuals. For the CEO, the airline's response still felt inadequate. Yes, they'd fired people. And yes, they'd pledged money, but where was the real change? Where was the acknowledgement that this wasn't just about one incident, but about a culture that enabled discrimination to persist? Determined to keep the spotlight on systemic reform, the CEO decided to take matters into his own hands. Leveraging his resources and connections, he launched a nonprofit initiative aimed at combating racism in the travel industry. Called Skyward Equality, the organization provided resources and advocacy for marginalized travelers, working to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, could travel with dignity and respect. He also partnered with civil rights groups and legal experts to draft a set of guidelines for airlines and other travel companies, outlining best practices for preventing discrimination. These guidelines included mandatory training programs for staff, stricter policies around passenger treatment, and independent oversight committees to hold companies accountable. His goal was simple: to create a blueprint for change that other industries could adopt as well. Meanwhile, the elderly woman watched the unfolding drama with mixed emotions. On one hand, she was proud of her son for turning her experience into something positive. She admired his determination to fight for justice, not just for their family, but for everyone who had ever felt invisible or undervalued. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel uneasy about the attention. She wasn't used to being In the spotlight, and the thought of strangers dissecting her life made her uncomfortable. Still, she understood why this mattered. Sometimes, standing up for yourself meant standing up for others too. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the scandal continued to reverberate throughout the aviation industry. Other airlines began implementing stricter anti-discrimination policies, spurred by the fear of facing similar public scrutiny. For the CEO, though, the victory felt bittersweet. Holding one company accountable was a step in the right direction, but the fight against prejudice was far from over. True progress required more than hashtags or lawsuits. It demanded unwavering commitment to building a better, fairer world. And so, the legacy of the elderly woman's courage lived on, not just in the lives of her family, but in the countless others inspired to demand respect, dignity, and equality wherever they went. Months had passed since the incident on the flight, but its impact lingered like ripples in a pond. The airline at the center of the storm had made promises, big ones, but whether those promises would translate into real change remained to be seen. For the elderly woman and her son, life had returned to some semblance of normalcy, though neither of them could forget the whirlwind they'd been through. What started as a quiet moment between mother and son had grown into something much larger than either of them could have anticipated. The CEO often found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Late at night, when the world outside his office window was still, he'd sit back in his chair and think about the journey they'd taken. It wasn't just about holding one airline accountable. It was about shining a light on systemic issues that affected countless people every day. He remembered the stories shared by travelers who reached out after hearing about the incident. Stories of being treated unfairly because of their race, gender, or background. Each story reinforced his belief that the fight for equality was far from over. One evening, during a rare quiet moment, he sat down with his mother over dinner. They talked about how things had changed, not just for them, but for others too. "It's funny," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I never thought standing my ground on that plane would lead to all this. I just wanted to sit where I paid to sit." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "But maybe sometimes standing up for yourself is more important than you realize." Her words resonated deeply with him. Growing up, she had always taught him the value of resilience. Life wasn't fair, she'd say, but that didn't mean you had to accept injustice without question. Now, years later, her lesson had come full circle. Her quiet act of defiance had inspired thousands and even pushed an entire industry to reconsider its practices. For the elderly woman, the attention had been overwhelming at times. Strangers recognized her in public, thanking her for speaking out. Journalists continued to reach out, asking for interviews or comments. She handled it all with grace, politely declining most requests and focusing instead on what truly mattered to her: family, faith, and living a peaceful life. But privately, she felt a sense of pride, knowing that her experience had sparked meaningful conversations, gave her a renewed sense of purpose. As for the nonprofit initiative Skyward Equality, it had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What began as a small project spearheaded by the CEO had blossomed into a nationwide movement. Travelers from all walks of life joined forces, sharing their experiences and advocating for change. The organization worked tirelessly to push airlines, hotels, and other travel companies to adopt stricter anti-discrimination policies. Training programs were developed, partnerships formed, and independent oversight committees established to ensure accountability. Slowly but surely, signs of progress began to emerge. Other airlines followed suit, implementing reforms to prevent similar incidents from happening again. Some introduced anonymous reporting systems so passengers could flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Others partnered with civil rights organizations to provide ongoing education for employees. Even government regulators took notice, proposing new laws to protect travelers' rights and hold companies accountable for discriminatory practices. Despite these victories, the CEO knew there was still work to be done. Change didn't happen overnight, especially when it came to dismantling deeply ingrained biases. There were moments when frustration crept in, when yet another company dragged its feet, or when critics dismissed the movement as unnecessary. But he reminded himself of his mother's wisdom. Progress was rarely linear. Every step forward, no matter how small, counted. He also realized that while he couldn't control everything, he could focus on what was within his power. That meant continuing to amplify voices that often went unheard. It meant staying vigilant, calling out injustice whenever he saw it, and using his platform to demand better. And it meant remembering why he started this journey in the first place, not for fame or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. One day, as he scrolled through social media, he came across a post from a young traveler. The person recounted their own experience of being treated unfairly at an airport and thanked Skyward Equality for giving them the courage to speak up. Reading the message, he felt a lump form in his throat. This was why it mattered. Not for headlines or hashtags, but for the individuals whose lives were touched, for the people who now felt empowered to stand up for themselves. The elderly woman noticed the change in him over time. He seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of the world. She teased him about it once, saying, "Looks like you're finally learning to let go." He laughed, knowing she was right. While the fight wasn't over, he'd learned to find joy in the little victories. Whether it was seeing a new policy implemented or hearing someone share their story, each win fueled his determination to keep going. As the years went by, the memory of the flight faded for many, but its legacy endured. Conversations about fairness and equality in travel became part of the cultural fabric, inspiring other industries to examine their own practices. Schools began teaching lessons about standing up for what's right, using the story of the elderly woman and her son as an example of courage and resilience. Even airlines that had once resisted change embraced it, proving that pressure from the public could lead to meaningful action. Looking back, the CEO realized that the true victory wasn't just about holding one company accountable, it was about creating a ripple effect. By standing up for his mother, he'd given others permission to stand up for themselves too. And in doing so, he'd helped build a community united by a shared goal, making the world a fairer, kinder place. For the elderly woman, the experience left an indelible mark. She often told her grandchildren about the flight and the events that followed, not to boast, but to remind them of the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. "You don't have to be loud or angry to make a difference," she'd say. "Sometimes, all it takes is saying no when something isn't right." And so, the legacy of that seemingly ordinary flight lived on not just in the lives of the mother and son, but in the countless others inspired to demand respect, dignity, and equality wherever they went. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could spark extraordinary change.